Have you ever seen or heard people use the word research? There's a variety of different ways to kind of think about research, but it's a term that gets overused a lot. And it's oftentimes associated with pain for a lot of students, right? Oh my gosh, why would I want to research something like that? I remember when I was in college, the term research was oftentimes synonymous with like an English composition class. Your teacher would tell you you'd have to do a research project and then compile all that information together into some sort of an essay. That's not what we mean when we say research. And so I figure what would be most important for us as students, as scientists, is to really take this first lesson and try and define what we mean when we say research. So let's look at two common instances where the word research is utilized. So on the left-hand side, I've got a few silhouettes here that's representing general public usage. Think about people like maybe your parents or your significant other or somebody who's on the internet. When they hear the term research or they say the term research, what are they really talking about? Well, oftentimes these people are just trying to gain a little bit of knowledge to look into something, right? So you might say, I'm trying to look something up. They might go to the internet and try and research maybe a recipe they may want to try, or before they book a hotel, spend money on booking a hotel, let's say, maybe they want to research customer reviews, or maybe they did some research on the best new phone to buy, right? So what features does it have? In a lot of these cases, this is a very kind of a personal usage of the term research, right? It's not really for the betterment of humanity so much. It's really just kind of for personal gain in a lot of these cases here. I know drives my wife nuts, but whenever she confronts me with a question, usually about the house, oftentimes my response to that is, I don't know, let me research it, and I'll get back with you on that one. Which in my mind, researching there is, yeah, I'm going to look it up on the internet, or I'm going to go try and find a video about it or something like that. Maybe look it up in a book that I have. We have a small library in our house. But that's it. It's a short-termed, task-focused usage is really what that comes down to in a general sense. The thing that drives her nuts is that I always get sidetracked, so I never get quite into where I need to go here. But here's the important point. It's going to rely heavily upon existing information. So things like Google and YouTube and sometimes blogs, social media in general. And there's usually not a lot of original data that's collected. It's more of kind of like a selection. Although I will say, generative AI has really helped in these processes because what can it do? It can compile information from like 300 websites within the blink of an eye, and that can help you narrow down your general public research, right? That's the thing that you're trying to do. But really, ultimately, the goal there is trying to make some sort of a personal decision or just gain some quick understanding. That's pretty much what it comes down to. 5 words or less, as we like to say in the Carr household. How is this different than academic usage? Academic usage is a little bit different here because what's happening in this case is we are emphasizing very careful investigation for 2 main reasons. Number one, we're trying to generate some new knowledge. Right? So maybe we don't know about a particular phenomenon. Maybe we design an experiment to try to research what a particular phenomenon is all about, what it can do. Sometimes it's also to deepen the understanding, right? Maybe we have a very surface level understanding of a particular effect. We think about things in like psychology, for example. Why do people learn a certain way that they do? Maybe there's a old school theory that helps describe how people learn a certain way. And then maybe you want to go a little bit deeper than that. All right, so this is what the theory says, but let's kind of start getting into the nitty gritty of this and sort of seeing how well does that theory hold if we, manipulate this variable or that variable. So we can see that there's a big difference between the two of them, right? And it's not always scientific research whenever we're talking about academic usage. It's like things like, why do historians disagree about the start of World War I? Right? That is a very deep research question right there. What started World War I? A lot of historians will tell you it was not the assassination of Franz Ferdinand. It was actually a combination of things that just happened to be the tipping point right there. Or maybe you want to know things like How does the voltage potential change when copper electrodes are replaced with zinc electrodes, if you're looking at an electrolytic cell? Or what are the defining characteristics of a planet? Or why do many college-age students prefer kinesthetic learning over other learning types? These are very deep questions, and for us to obtain those answers, we have to take a deep dive into, in a lot of cases, data collection to try to get this. And so this is the big deal. This is the big difference between the two. General research is going to involve, like I said, making a very personal decision or a quick understanding of some sort. Whereas academic research typically is going to be very more structured. It's going to generate new data in a lot of cases. We may verify some data in a lot of cases. We may collect some results or collect some data, which we would call results, I guess, in this case, compare it against a theory or some widely held assumption, and then we even go so far as to communicate the results. So share our findings with other academics to help their research endeavors, whether they're currently doing it or maybe at some point in the future. That's a big difference between general public usage and academic usage. All right, so we're clearly going to be in the realm of academic usage in this case here. So what are the goals of research? What is the why behind the research that we do? Well, there's three main goals that we're typically looking for. So on the far left-hand side, we describe this as pure or basic research. And so what this is the focus here is typically undirected, generally speaking. It's very academic heavy in a lot of these cases. And so a great example of this is Bohr's planetary model. So when Niels Bohr was trying to come up with some sort of an explanation for how electrons are organized around the atom, there was a lot of research he had to do to obtain a deeper understanding of what was known about atoms and how do we bring all this information into some sort of a brand new model. There wasn't a prize at the end of this. There wasn't a paycheck at the end of this. This was entirely intended to have a better understanding of how the natural world works around us. And that is the heart of pure, or what we call basic research. Now, applied research, think about applied research, think about the movie like was it Batman Begins, right? There's an applied research division in Bruce Wayne's enterprise. And what are they doing there? They are inventing tools and or solving some problems, right? So a great example of this is Thomas Edison's light bulb. Right? So now very few people realize this, but the light bulb had actually been invented before Edison. But his job was to try to come up with a fairly inexpensive filament to try to make cheap, long-lasting light bulbs. And so there was a prize at the end of this too. If you can make cheap, long-lasting light bulbs, people are going to want to buy your light bulb over a competitor's. And so this is a great example of what applied science is all about here. How about developmental science? So developmental science is where we're trying to make some technological advancements, right? So maybe we have some pretty good deep understanding of some sort, but maybe we need to take that understanding a little bit further. Or maybe we have a technology already in place, or we have some sort of a device that we already have. We need to make it a little bit better, right? We may need to take a deeper dive into how it works. And a great example of this is Louis Pasteur and his research that he had done on beer and wine spoilage. Very few people know this whole story, but the country of France was going through a massive crisis around the time Louis Pasteur was in his prime. And the problem that was going on is that all the beer and wine was spoiling in that country. And that was a big deal because beer and wine was a massive part of France's economy. And so Pasteur rose to the challenge to try to understand what is causing beer and wine to spoil. So yeah, there was an economic gain in this case, but what was most important here is that we knew how the fermentation process worked. We knew it was useful for a particular economic aspect, I guess, if we want to think about it that way. But here's what's most important about it. He was able to take an existing technology and try to make an advancement in it. I know you're thinking to yourself, you're thinking, well, isn't that really what Edison really did too as well? And that's where it gets a little gray in some of these cases. We like thinking about putting these things into silos because it's very convenient, but there is a lot of gray. And we don't want to get too hung up on the why, but it's good to be aware of really the three main motivators behind doing any type of an academic research endeavor, I guess, if you want to think about it this way. All right, so we looked at the why. What about the how? What are the typical common research methods that we will see if we're going to conduct some research? So, research, generally speaking, breaks down into one of two different categories. It can be experimental research or it can be observational research. Let's deal with the observational research first. This is the easiest one to understand. So observational research is the instance where we will be generally just watching a particular phenomenon that happens here. And so what's important to notice about this, conceptually speaking, is that we're observing something within its natural state. We're watching something in its natural state. There is no manipulation whatsoever. So we see a lot of this in educational research. We see a lot of this, I guess educational and psychology research is very similar, as is sociology. But sometimes we see this in biological research as well too, right? Maybe there's a new organism that has been discovered and we don't want to sit there and run tests on it. Maybe we just want to sit and watch how does it behave, right? Maybe we blend in with the environment. We watch this new organism behave in its natural state. That would be observational, better yet, we call it conceptual research. We are not manipulating anything. We're observing things in its natural state. This is different than experimental research. So remember, experimental research is where we're going to start manipulating things. This is where we're going to start screwing around with things, I guess, if you want to put it that way, right? And so experimental research on the left side of the screen really boils down into two main categories. We have empirical research. This is the one that most science students are most familiar with. This is that stereotypical science research, right? That is we make an observation, we ask a question, we develop a hypothesis, and then we run a bunch of experiments to try to test that hypothesis. That is, in essence, what the scientific method is. Hypothetico-deducto method. Thank you. Was it Bacon who came up with that? I don't know, whatever. The point is that we are testing hypotheses by manipulating some variables. That's what empirical research is all about. Theoretical research, a little bit different. When we think theoretical research, it's very crucial to think about this as being synonymous with mathematics. So usually there's going to be, now I'm not saying it's just research done in math, I'm saying usually there's some sort of a mathematical model that has been established that people more or less agree upon. And as we are pursuing better understanding of that model, we might be trying to stress that model out by altering different variables, or maybe manipulating that model in another way, maybe expanding upon the definition of the model, or maybe even reducing the definition of the model. Really, our goal is to explore that particular model. And you see this a lot whenever you're dealing with things like, well, in chemistry, we deal with things like quantum mechanics. I know you'd be like, oh my gosh, quantum mechanics, that sounds terrible. But you got to remember, a lot of computer modeling that's done nowadays, whether it's on drug design or you're designing maybe a new molecule of interest for industry or whatever it is, or maybe you're looking at what part of the molecule is most reactive in a chemical reaction. What are you really doing? You're using quantum mechanics in a lot of cases to try to understand what that model looks like. So you're exploring these various models. What can they do? What information can they provide? All right, so we've got the why, we've got the how. Great. What does this all basically reduce down to? Big picture. Where does chemistry fit into this? Again, we don't want to think about this in terms of it being siloed as it's like chemistry must be blah, 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 blah. Generally speaking, the goal of chemistry is often pure. It's very, very academic, right? So what does that basically mean? We have an interest in something. We want to try to understand exactly what is going on for that particular phenomenon for the sake of understanding it. Now, sometimes it can be developmental, right? And so you think about not quite purely applied research in a lot of cases, but you sort of think about like maybe they have an existing technology of some sort, or an existing chemical reaction that's beneficial, but maybe you're trying to optimize that chemical reaction to make it better. Maybe you have a chemical reaction that yields, I don't know, maybe 50% product, and you want to get in there and manipulate some variables until you get to the point where you can increase the yield from 50% to maybe 75%, right? So in that case, we can think about it as being developmental, right? Or optimizing a particular process, let's say. But that's not saying we can't have applied research as well, too. In fact, chemistry research could really be all three of these. A really good friend of mine is an applied chemist. He's an applied scientist, but he's a chemist, right? And so he works for a company that makes electrical devices, and one of his jobs is to take existing devices and try to make some aspect of that technology a little bit better. Why? What's the driving force? They're trying to turn a profit within that company, right? They noted that there's a problem with a particular product that they're trying to sell. They're trying to make it a little bit better here. So it really depends upon the what it is that you're trying to do here. But for the most part, we often think about chemistry research as being pure, sometimes developmental. In terms of methods, the stereotypical way of looking at chemistry is often going to be experimental, right? So we're going to go into the laboratory. We have an experiment that we're going to do, and we may start manipulating some variables along the way here. Now, it can be theoretical. So if you're into computer modeling, this could be of interest to you right there, right? So maybe you're looking at I don't know, a good example of this is proteins, right? So big, massive molecules that contain carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. Your body has thousands of proteins in it. And maybe you're trying to figure out what molecule turns the protein on or shuts the protein off, right? So instead of actually isolating the protein, which can be very, very expensive to do something like that, maybe you build it in a computer and then you put different molecules into that protein to see which one causes the protein to turn on or off, right? That's your theoretical aspect right there. It can also be observational. Observational is a little trickier. We don't see it often in chemistry, but you do see this a lot in like environmental chemistry, right? So if you're trying to measure, maybe you're measuring the air quality that's being output by a particular industrial process or something like that. Maybe you're not necessarily manipulating any variables, but maybe you are measuring how much of a gas, let's say, is released into the atmosphere or something like that. I don't know. I'm just trying to come up with something off the top of my head. We don't deal with observational chemistry all too much. We're going to lean mostly on experimental. All right, so big punchline. What does all this mean for students that are taking this course? Research is not going to involve just looking things up. And don't get me wrong, occasionally we just have to look things up. And I get that, I understand that. But for the most part, the heart of what we're trying to do is variable manipulation. That is, we're trying to collect and interpret information or data for the sake of addressing voids, for the sake of understanding parts of chemistry that we don't know. It's great to do an experiment in the lab, and it's great to blow things up, but you got to understand, we know a lot about this world, but there's a lot of things that we still don't know much about. And so as chemists, as researchers, our job is to use our training and try to address those unknowns. How do we do that? Manipulate some variables and try to get some meaning or some interpretation from what we've done here. Now, the key elements of research: productive research, developing some sort of a testable question. So it's got to be tangible. It's got to be something that we can actually measure. It's got to be clear. Coming up with an appropriate method to answer that particular question, right? So are we doing the right, are we measuring the right things? And think about here for a second, real simple example of this. How many green M&Ms are going to be in a bag of M&Ms, right? Maybe that's our testable question. The appropriate method, something appropriate would be to literally count the green M&Ms. Something that would be inappropriate would be to weigh the mass of the M&Ms. That may not tell you very much right there. So it's important to think about the method that we're using to try to address that particular question. And then, hopefully, our goal is to be able to find some understanding so that we can contribute to the bigger picture. You got to remember the research that we're doing here has to make a contribution to somebody either currently or in the future, usually in the future. So it is important that we do the best job that we can in the laboratory to try to get as much information as we can. And then when we report our information for other scientists, to leave them enough breadcrumbs so that they can pick up from where we left off, or they can gain some meaning based on what we were able to determine. So that is research in a nutshell. Hope you got a little something from this here. We'll see you in the next lesson.